Hi friends, warm welcome to you. Welcome to Making Disciples podcast. My name is Chris Rogers and I am your host. Hey, hope you're having a good week. Hope you're doing all right. Today's episode is another interview, and today it's with Andrew Ollerton of the Bible Society. If you've heard of the Quiet Revival, then the Quiet Revival report coming out of the Bible Society, we had Andrew at Spring Harvest this year, and he was speaking into that and shared some of the research of the Quiet Revival. It's just been so interesting just to see, what has been happening over the last 5 or 6, 7 years in terms of the church, young people, particularly young men. So I messaged him after Spring Harvest, said, look, love to get you on the podcast to talk about this. And he said, well, actually, I've got a book coming out. And the book's called God's Book. And it's an honest look at the Bible's 7 toughest topics. Well, Andrew sent me a copy, and there are some books you read and you go, that's great, I'll pop that down there, and you never touch it again. There are some books that you actually have on your shelf, I think, that you go back to and go back to and go back to, just because there's things in there you think, yeah, that'll be useful for a small group or a Bible study kind of later down the line. That's exactly what this book is. And it's just really, really fun walking from Genesis through to Revelation, through some of the toughest topics in the Bible. So I'm going to interview Andrew about the book, and I just think it's brilliant. It is a real. I'm here as I'm recording, just kind of flicking through, just reminding myself some of the things that are in here, because it's rich in information, but it's also rich in that kind of information that you don't always find in book. Archaeology is one of the things that's in this book. In those that know me know I'm really into archaeology, biblical archaeology. So there's a lot in here that I think people would find really, really interesting. I'm aware that because I just said it's got things in it like biblical archaeology, now there were some people going, oh, that book's not for me because I'm not into archaeology. No, please, don't let me have just put you off by mentioning archaeology. It's a tiny bit of a massive book. So let's dive into an interview with Andrew Ollerton on God's Book. Andrew, welcome to Making Disciples. This is really exciting to have you with us today.
Thanks, Chris. I always like chatting to you, my friend. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
It's brilliant. This has been it feels to me like this has been quite a 12 months for you. You've had quite a lot going on. And, we'll start with conversation about the Quiet Revival. We'll talk about the book that you've got coming out, but you've helped someone else with their book as well.
Yeah.
It's been a big year, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. And I think, often I remember someone having a picture for me a few years ago. They said they felt the Lord was saying that they saw like a lighthouse, where the lighthouse sort of spins round, and there's a moment where it goes dark, and then it sort of throws out the light again. And they said that that I needed to get comfortable, that was part of my calling. In other words, there are seasons where you go dark, you go underground, you're working on things, and it's hard work, and sometimes it's behind closed doors. And then there's other seasons where the light throws out, isn't there, and things come out into the public domain. And you're right, this year's been one of those years where lots of things I've been working on in the dark a bit with Bear Grylls, on my own, with Bible Society. They're all launching, so there's a lot of light coming, which is great.
It is really good. Now, I do want to talk to you about the Quiet Revival. I have to ask the question, who came up with that? I mean, everyone is using that terminology. I went to the US in March, and I heard it used at the Exponential Global Leaders Conference there. Who came up with that little phrase?
Well, the nomenclature, the name, the phrase, a team in Bible Society absolutely can't take any credit for that. Rhiannon McAleer and her team, who head up research in Bible Society, not only did they spearhead the research project, which for listeners, it has 2 reference points, really. 2018, there was a huge piece of research done then about people's views about faith and the Bible and church. And then in 2024, they redid the same questions effectively. So the Quiet Revival is a research project, first and foremost, that's sort of testing the waters. And what we found in 2018 was what we expected to find. The church is getting older. Younger people aren't going. 4% of young people were going to church, self-declaring that they're going to church once a month or more in 2018. What we didn't expect to find, although there'd been some rumbling. So I think we all knew that something was shifting. The landscape was shifting, but we were still surprised by the findings in 2024, which meant it quadrupled. 16% of young people now saying they're going to church, and that's 21% for young men. So the nomenclature, that the name Quiet Revival, I think what it's trying to say is something major is changing, revival, but it's subtle, quiet. It's not. I don't know about you. When I first read the reports, I almost sort of opened my front door, half expecting there to be a queue of people outside asking to understand the Christian faith. And it's like, what this actually, that's completely misunderstanding the point. It's not that suddenly there's a classic revival of droves of people going to church, crying on the way in repentance of sin. It's a quiet revival. What it means is there's a trickle of people, and most churches, many churches, are just saying, almost. I find when you ask people about it, initially they say, "No, I don't think we're seeing that," and then they pause and they say, "But we did it. We did baptize a couple of young guys, and we haven't done that for many years." These little indications something shifting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, when I was in the US, it was Ed Stetzer. I don't know if you come across Ed Stetzer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
phenomenal guy, really, in terms of tracking Christian faith, church planting, everything. He was using it, and he was like, I'm borrowing this from the Bible Society." And I was like, wow, when you come up with something like that someone like that is quoting,
yeah,
people are listening and taking note, aren't they? It's quite.
they really are. And I think my encouragement to our listeners, when you think about the word, whether you like the use of the word revival or not, I'd say don't get hung up on that. Simply recognize what it's saying is the spiritual landscape around us is shifting. We can agree on that. You may prefer the phrase. I heard it was Krish Kandaya, actually. I was speaking about with Christian. He said that he preferred the phrase that there's not that there's a classic revival, but there's a revived interest in the Christian faith, in the Bible, in church. That's good too. I think one of the things I really feel is important is that we don't think there's almost the risk with revival is we think, oh, God's just sorting it all out. That's not what this is saying. There's everything to play for. So we have to be really engaged. Yeah.
And what's interesting is this research maps on very easily to, Rachel Jordan Wolf and Hope have done a bit of research talking Jesus with the EA, and it's all pointing in the same direction. So it's not just one piece of research, it's actually multiples are all echoing the same thing. And I loved the bit in the research about the Bible. I'm the Bible guy. I love teaching scripture. I want to get people into the word. And so actually the statistics just around the Bible, could you just talk to us a little bit about what's going on in terms of Bible interest?
Yeah. Well, I think that's, you and I are on kindred spirits here. That's my interest. I was always drawn. In fact, I think I sent over to you, didn't I? Like a little summary of the kind of headlines specifically around the Bible, because for me, that's where my interest is drawn. And I think I want to say it's two things at once, really. The Bible is simultaneously, the phrase I've been using is the Bible is trending, which I think is a nice way of just capturing the idea. Something has majorly shifted about public perceptions of the Bible. So often this is captured in generationally. For me, when I was 15 years of age, I was embarrassed to be associated with the Bible. And I think I realized that would not be a good look amongst your friends or rugby playing friends or whatever it was for me. My 15-year-old son now, and I'm slightly shocked to say I have a son who's 15, but I do. My 15-year-old son, he's in such a different place with his friends because some of them are asking for a Bible. So there's something that whereas I might have thought the Bible, was a problem, was a something to be avoided being associated with. Many young people today think it's a gift. They're intrigued. So something's majorly shifted in the public perception. Yeah.
One of my assistant ministers keeps buying Bibles to give away to people at the gym, and it's costing £2 a pop. And I said, look, we just need to pray that we can get our hands on some Bibles and good ones, like not just cheapy ones, that some really nice ones. And last week I got an email from a vicar in the neighborhood going, oh, I've just got like 100 Bibles I don't want. I've got 100 Bibles I don't want if anybody wants them. And I went straight round on Wednesday this week to pick them up. They're great leather Bibles, NIV, and the plan is to give them away. We want to do 4 weeks to give away 100 Bibles. And for me, you just want to get this. If people want it, put it in their hand.
Well, I totally agree. And I think one of the challenges, we're almost having to get with what's shifting. We're still living in the past a little bit and assuming the Bible is something that people roughly think they know and they don't want any more of it. They've had it pushed to them at school or at church or whatever in their upbringing. And they're kind of saying, I'm done with the Bible bashing thing. I don't want that. Listen, that is not where the younger generation are at. They've never been Bible bashed. They've no idea what the Bible's about. So there's a huge ignorance. They don't know anything. But with that comes an enormous curiosity. What is this thing? And does it have something to offer? And I'm hearing more and more stories. I mean, so the stats are there. I love this sort of combination, if you like, of stats and stories. The stats are there. One of them that really got my attention was that 36% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK say they are interested in discovering more about the Bible. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Well over a third of the population would like to understand the Bible for themselves. That's the stat. But then you hear the story. You know, I just was at Big Church Festival recently, and just so many young men talking to me about their journey to faith. And often they just either in the pandemic, you know, when life was so majorly disrupted, or more recently, they just bought a Bible on Amazon. One guy I spoke to, I'm now in touch with, helping him on his journey a bit. His story really moved me. Can I tell a brief story?
Yeah, I've got loads of time. Go for
just
it.
just one little story that captures what I think is going on. So this young guy, I met him at a Christian event I was speaking at. He'd never been to a Christian event before. He came to this event just because he sat next to someone at a basketball match who was a Christian, who had the courage to chat to him and invite him. So, you know, one of the stats from the Quiet Revival is about 33% of people say that if they were invited to church, they would like to go. I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? He was one of those people. He was invited. He said, "Yeah, I'd love to come." But then when he was at this event, he he shared a bit of his story. And the guy who met him at the basketball match knew nothing about this. But just 2 weeks earlier, he'd been sitting on top of a quarry, about to jump off and to end his life. He'd reached absolute rock bottom. He'd been rejected by his family. He had no purpose, no hope in life. He was about to end it. And he said to me, and then that's when I heard him. And I said, "What did you hear?" And he said, I heard him say to me, "This is not how your story ends." So instead of jumping off the quarry, thank the Lord, he walked down from the quarry, went to W.H. Smith and bought a Bible. And so this young guy, no experience of Christianity whatsoever, just starts reading the Bible. And I said to him, where did you begin? And he looked at me like I was stupid. And he said, "Well, at the beginning." You know, in other words, you know, straight in at the Old Testament. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you start a book at the beginning? But he said to me, "From the moment I started reading the Bible, things have been getting better for me." And at this event, he gave his life to the Lord, and I've been helping him, discipling him a bit forwards. But his story is what really gets my heart. You know, the statistics are one thing, but when you meet the people behind the statistics, you realize this is life and death. This really matters. And the Bible's playing an important role in helping people find hope.
Right. Have you heard the story about Bill Murray?
No.
So cool. So there's a guy in America who felt like the Lord said, "I want you to give Bibles away to famous people and pray for, you know, somebody you want to give it to, and we'll get you there to it." Anyway, he's done it a few times. Well, he was telling a story about Bill Murray and how he felt like the Lord said, "I want you to get the Bible to Bill Murray." So he got this Bible. He had Bill Murray printed on the front of it in gold lettering, and paid to go and see Bill Murray at an event to get his autograph. He thought that's the best way of getting there. When he got there, the event was ending and Bill was packing up, and they said, "Oh, you know, you have to go in quite quick and, you know, in and out. What's that in your hand?" So it's a gift for Bill. You can't give Bill gifts. You want it. And he was like, "Oh, okay, I'll put it in my coat. Forget it then. If it, you know, he won't take them." But he went through, met Bill, and Bill said, "What's in your coat?" He said, "I brought you a gift. It's a Bible." And his guys were going, "No, Bill doesn't take gifts." And Bill's going, "No, no, no, I love it. I love it." So Bill Murray takes this Bible, has a photograph with him, and then leaves. And then the guy is out back waiting for Bill to come out the back door to get in his car to drive off with other people just for another cheeky photograph. And Bill comes out, he's walking towards his car, turns around, sees the guy, and this is all on the guy sharing it online. Walks up to the guy and says, "You have just given me the best gift I've ever received. Thank you." Hugged it, got in the car and drove off.
Come on.
And he's
Wow.
trying to get the Bible. I just think it's a great story. I love Bill Murray to start with. But the fact that this guy got the Bible to Bill Murray and the security guards didn't want him to get it to him, but yet he somehow was able to get it. I think that's, come on.
Honestly, and that, you know, you just track with a number of people who have come to faith by reading the Bible, almost sometimes with other people journeying with them, sometimes not. Just the Bible is, and I think this has been a real wake up for me, because I remember when I was leading churches many years ago, I actually thought the Bible was a problem to mission. I don't know about you, but sometimes I almost held it back a little bit, thinking we need to bring people in through other means. And then only when they're in will we say, "Now you really should look at the Bible. I'm sorry, it's really long and complicated and controversial, but, you know, it's sort of part of the deal. Good luck," you know. But I actually think we've got, why would we be embarrassed about the world's best-selling book that
Well,
brings hope and meaning to people, you know?
and you probably don't know how I came to faith. The Gideons gave Bibles away at school.
Mm.
That little Gideon's Bible went in my drawer. I was failing school. I had, personal issues going on. And one evening, I pulled out that little red Bible and started reading that New Testament. And I found
Wow.
Jesus in those words. And I fell in love with Jesus. I was like, I can't do this Christianity. I'm not sure about this church thing, but Jesus, yes. And it was about a month into going, yeah, I'm reading the New Testament. I fall in love with Jesus. I felt like God said to me, well, you can't fall in love with my son and not fall in love with his bride. So really started to move towards falling in love with the church as well. But it's because I was given that little red Gideon's Bible.
Amazing. There you go. You're it. You're what I'm talking about. I just think who knows what happens when people engage with the Bible. And so I do think there's something new happening. The public perception of the Bible is changing. You just have to see how many influencers are more than happy to be associated with talking about sharing the Bible. And they may not be, church people at all, but for them, there's a recognition that the Bible's brought us many of the values that we hold dear, underpins a lot of civilization that we otherwise take for granted, and that we need it. And I think there is a meaning crisis happening alongside the more, if you like, intellectual reasons. There's also the deeply personal reasons, like this guy on the quarry that I'm talking about. There's huge challenges people are facing. The world feels very unstable at the moment, and I think people are reaching out for something solid, something that isn't an echo chamber or an algorithm, but something from beyond.
Well, you've written. Can we just talk about the book that you've written? I just think there's a
Mm.
place to kind of pivot to because I just love what you've done with that. So, God's book, an honest look at the Bible's 7 toughest questions. How did you know where to start?
Well, I didn't know about the Quiet Revival report, but just staying on that theme as a segue to it, none of this research was out I mean, as you know, these books take years, so this one's been in the making for a while. But it's interesting with the Quiet Revival report. The Bible is trending. I've said that, but I also think the Bible is challenging. It's both at the same time. So one of the stats that got my attention with the report is that 35% of young people who are going to church, these are church young people, say that their faith is undermined when they think about or read some parts of the Bible. And that really got my attention, actually. And I think the reason I highlight that stat, in other words, over a third of young people are saying, my faith is undermined by certain parts of the Bible. I think that really echoed with my story a bit. My own journey on this one. I grew up in a home where the Bible was taken for granted, and I'm so grateful for parents who gave me a sort of understanding of it, read stories from a young age. But I think what that left me with was a sort of faith that hadn't been road tested, a faith that hadn't, a Bible confidence that hadn't really been matured. And so for me, when I entered my late teenage years and especially university years, I really found a lot of questions raised that I wasn't ready for. I found a lot of things in the Bible as I read it more for myself that I was a bit disturbed by or perplexed by. So the book I've written, in a way, is the book I wish I'd had. I'm writing it to my, 21-year-old self or 18-year-old self. It's for all ages, but I simply mean many people, I think, hold beneath their surface sometimes. They almost don't feel permission to out it, but they hold some concerns around things they've read in the Bible. Why is there so much violence in the Old Testament? Or, what about this Paul's teaching on sex in the New Testament? Or, can we really believe all the miracles and things? So I wanted to write a book that moved through the story of the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, which is kind of my lane. I've done lots of things that help people understand the big story, but I wanted to loop back through the big story this time with an apologetics lens. And so Genesis to Revelation, I basically pick up on these 7 topics that I think, not only are they the toughest, but they're the ones that need to be understood in their context as well. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Are those topics like science, suffering, war, it's a whole bit about demons, sex, judgment, hell.
Yeah.
These are huge topics to be.
Yeah. When you put it like that, it's not a light read, is it?
How did you find confronting those topics personally? Not from what you put out, but how did that engage you as you explored those things?
Yeah, I think that was a good part of the journey actually for me. I've got to say, I often with books I've written, I often have a love-hate relationship with them. As in, on the one hand, I love it, and on the other hand, you can't wait for it to finish because the challenge is immense, isn't it? Pulling so much, distilling so much. And one of the reasons I love this particular journey of writing this book is because it kind of almost forced me to really think, what do I actually believe about these things? What does the Bible actually teach? Where have I adopted certain caricatures or stereotypes or assumptions that need to be unpicked? And what actually is solid ground of what the Bible is clearly teaching? Obviously, it's an introduction. It's 7 books in one, in a way, and many scholars would write whole books on just one of these 7 topics, and I've brought 7 into one book. So obviously it's introductory, and with that in mind, I decided not to go with a really dogmatic approach of telling everyone exactly what I think is right. I was trying to almost say, take the first part on creation, the creation stories. Can we really believe, trust the way Genesis describes our origins as a universe and as a human race? I was trying to say, actually, there are several different credible positions that you could hold. In other words, I'm not going to tell you, I do kind of share which I lean towards, but I'm not going to do this in a kind of, you must believe this. I'm going to do it more in the sense of, you don't have to feel intimidated by science. Science and scripture can go together. They help make sense of the world with different perspectives. And actually, there's perfectly credible positions you can adopt on scripture that are compatible with the findings of modern science. So all that to say, it was a journey for me. I certainly reached a lot more clarity on certain areas than I've had before. On others, I actually had to just sit back and say, you know what, I'm not resolving this. People over the centuries have wrestled with the issue of suffering, for example. It's not like I'm going to suddenly come up with an argument that's the deal clincher. What I'm doing is circling around many of these subjects. I like that idea that there are some things you can go straight for it in a linear fashion, in a kind of problem solution mode. And there are other things where you need to circle around it, seeing different perspectives, but never actually sort of nailing it, going straight into it. And I literally use that actually in the chapter on warfare and violence. In that chapter, I talk about the challenge of understanding the conquest of a city like Jericho and God authorizing the slaughter of men, women, and children, in these conquest narratives. And I say, rather than just charging straight in and trying to solve this problem, let's do what the Israelites did, circle around Jericho 7 times, just gaining 7 different perspectives on the problem. And I think that's honest.
Yeah. I'd love to ask you, whenever I write something, I always find that there's those things that I'm writing from a position of, this is really what, I'm kind of where I'm at. And then there's those things that I'm challenged personally by. I'm thinking, where do I fit? What do I think here? For you, what was the most challenging personally? Is there anything that I would say, moved your thinking on, or is there anything that kind of developed in your thinking as you were writing?
Well, I think every single one of these 7 parts, let me just list them and then I'll tell you the one that I would be answering that. But the 7 parts, Genesis to Revelation, are creation and science. That's part 1. Then the Exodus, laws of Moses, laws about holding slaves, particularly the more challenging laws that we find disturbing. That one I really did struggle with, because I think I wanted to hold a fairly simple position, which is that actually slavery in the Bible is very different to slavery in the kind of chattel slavery that we are familiar with in the more sort of early modern period, that the abolitionists campaign against. And I believe there is a lot of truth in that, but it's not quite as simple as that. And so I think the theme of slavery in the Bible, that I wrestle with that intellectually. But moving on, so you got creation and science, Exodus and the laws of Moses, Joshua and the conquest of the promised land and the issue of warfare and violence, exile and the issue of why does God allow suffering. Jesus, then in the Gospels, I focused on the miracles and exorcisms of Jesus. I'm going to come back to that because that's probably the one in answering your question. But just to finish the 7, the penultimate one was Paul's letters and the issue of sexuality. And then the final one, Revelation and the sort of visions of judgment and heaven and hell. But in answering your question, which did I find most sort of, that I had to do a lot more thinking or questioning of myself? I think it was actually the one on miracles and exorcisms, because I don't know about you, Chris, but I've been in the university so many years, off and on. And it trains you in sort of rationalist thinking that just it cannot examine and therefore cannot accommodate or take seriously that which is not rationally perceived, that which goes beyond the principles of rationality and science and the empirical studies that we can do. look, there's many good things about that, but what it does mean is you have this massive blind spot, I think, and you're almost inculcated with a innate skepticism towards anything miraculous, anything supernatural. Now, I'm a sort of evangelical charismatic, so I've always, it's not that I've ever denied these things at all. What writing that chapter did for me was it just made me aware. Do you know what? I think I still need to be purged of this almost instinctive suspicion of the supernatural. And one of the scholars that I read on this a lot, Craig Keener, who you may be familiar with, who's a brilliant New Testament scholar, but his story is intriguing on this because he basically wanted to footnote in a commentary on Acts just one serious consideration of contemporary miracles, and he literally couldn't find it. So he ended up writing the thing himself, this massive 2-volume work, which you probably read, Miracles in the New Testament. And in that, he not only examines the New Testament evidence and so forth, but he also gives this extraordinary kind of compendium of contemporary stories of healings and miracles. And I felt like it was almost a detox for me, reading that again. It's not actually the first time I've read it. It's the first time I read it carefully. It was almost a detox. And I just had to recognize there is this kind of elitist, superior, proud, arrogant bit in me that has assumed that especially stories from the global south of miracles, I don't know, there's sort of this deep mistrust. And that has to be purged because there's nothing biblical or Christian about that. It's just this kind of rationalist, anti-supernatural trait that I've been bred into. So anyway, long-winded answer, that was a real challenge to me, almost at a personal level. And I'm still working that through, I'd say.
I was asked to go Bible teach in Denmark a number of years ago on the names of Jesus, essentially. And I'd done this whole hour on the power in the name of Jesus. And as it finished, I invited people to respond in prayer. And actually, over the left, I could see something going on. And there was a woman manifesting this demon. And they were what I would describe as bashing her around the head with a Bible. And I said to somebody, is that how you deal with these kind of things here? And like, we don't know how to do this. We're very much head theologians in practice. And I suddenly realized that how often do we practice that stuff? I'm much more comfortable preaching on that stuff than I am practicing that stuff. And then there's a problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And specifically what you just raised there, the issue of exorcisms, you just noted it really, but I very deliberately, most apologetics books only really address the David Hume skepticism of the sort of early Enlightenment period. In other words, most apologetics just want to basically build a case that it is possible that miracles could happen, right? Meanwhile, culture's moved on, hasn't it? The vast majority of people are into crystals and all sorts of stuff. In other words, we are a highly supernaturally oriented culture now, even if the universities and the academies haven't shifted that much. Culture has. And my concern was actually, it's not so much that we're closed to the supernatural. Potentially our risk now is we're so open that we're almost naive to the spiritual forces at play. And I use an analogy actually towards the end of that chapter. I talk about how, if imagine there's an island and you manage to get rid of, you have a campaign to sort of purge most of the snakes from the island. From that time onwards, you would expect most citizens on the island will not encounter snakes, But if you allow them to rebreed, if you allow a sort of rewilding to happen, sooner or later, people are going to start getting bitten again. And I just feel there's been a sort of almost rewilding of the secular West with all kinds of harmful forces of spirituality and evil. And people are being bitten again. And we need to speak more confidently and take more seriously things like exorcisms and demons and spiritual powers, or else we leave people just feeling isolated with their experiences, which are very real and almost like it's very real, but I can't talk about it because I sound stupid.
Definitely. I agree with you on that one. I like the rewilding analogy. Just keeping on moving, because there was a few other things I want to talk to you about the book. Number one, I absolutely love the bit when you start talking about Gilgamesh and other creation stories, and actually how within Genesis we can approach Genesis thinking only the Bible says some of this stuff, but actually when you start looking at the Mesopotamian, Babylonian archaeology, there are these stories all over. And just comment on that for a moment. That really spoke to me. I'm a uh, I'm somebody who loves archaeology. I'm somebody who loves, trying to find things in the real world, not just in the book. So just comment on that for a
Mm.
moment.
Yeah, no, thanks for drawing attention to that. I think I used an analogy in that section where I talked about how many of us, when we read the Old Testament, we're a bit like Brits abroad. You go to a foreign land with no intention of understanding anything to do with the local culture, or you just go there to have a bit of fun and then go home again, still drinking at the Red Lion or whatever, but this time in Greece. Um, and I sort of feel like what I was trying to do with my section on Genesis is say, actually, if you just go native a little bit, if you just give a bit of time to asking what world did Genesis originate in? What not our world, not just quick. I need quick answers to questions like, should we believe in evolution or not? We can get to that, but start with what was the context of Genesis and the ancient world in which it was an origin story. And the point you're making is, archaeologists have discovered many accounts, whether Egyptian or Mesopotamian, from the ancient world. Not all will be contemporary with Genesis, depending on how you date Genesis. But leaving that aside, many of them talk about some familiar aspects of the Genesis story, whether a great flood. It seems to me that part of that is actually confirmatory, that there was some kind of catastrophic deluge. And it's not surprising then that several ancient accounts pick up on it, because it was a freak feature of the ancient world's experience. So you get stories of the flood, along with other stories of the demiurge but the point I make in the book is, actually, whereas initially scholars, when these were discovered, jumped on the idea that Genesis is almost just a form of plagiarism, it's just kind of ripped ideas and from every other source and stitched them together. Actually, what we see in Genesis is a counter narrative. I believe it's saying, these other stories, but let me tell you the real story. And I think that my view is, when we work a bit harder to go back and understand it in its context, it then speaks louder. It's not that we find it's less relevant, we find it's more relevant to the context we're in, because today there are many other origin stories being told about where we've come from and who we are as human beings. And just as Genesis was a counter narrative telling the true story then, I think that's why we need it now. So, I mean, I don't know what you picked up on with that, but that's part of what I was trying to do.
Yeah, no, I love it. So for me, it's not what's the same; it's what's different.
Yeah, exactly.
When you read, I was just reading over the summer Irving Finkel's book on his Ark stone, that he translated. The earliest versions of Noah's Ark from a Babylonian perspective, and it's not what's the same; it's what's different. I find that what's interesting. Why is it that Yahweh's telling of that story has a very different foundation?
Yes.
It's the same with Genesis and Gilgamesh. What's different? That's what makes the story, the Christian telling of the story, so interesting, because Yahweh is always compassionate, loving, creative, working with his people, looking for partnership. It's not about war. It's not about conflict. So I loved that. I thought that whole section, the counter, it's what's different.
I love that. I think you're spot on. And I think when you also appreciate that a lot of these ancient narratives, they were kind of, I think I use this phrase, they were kind of anxiety inducing, really, because what you've actually got in the heavens is a big fight and squabble and contest going on that sort of makes sense of this world where chaos seems, there's almost this fear, perpetual fear that chaos is taking over. And I think what Genesis is trying to do is say, actually, sleep well at night, won't you? There's one God who made all things by the power of his word, and even Leviathan, even the oceans that were sort of seen as this primeval chaos, even the oceans, even the sea monsters are just called forth by his voice. And when you then echo that through to the New Testament, where Jesus is speaking to the storms, you just feel like, well, whatever chaos is going on in our world right now, and there's plenty, we can sleep well at night. There is one God, and he is not threatened, but brings peace.
Amazing. Before we finish, I'd love to. So you've written your book, but also you've been working with someone else on their book, which is, I think, has just been all over the place. When you start hearing radio interviews with Bear Grylls on this stuff, it's really exciting. How the heck did you get involved with working with Bear Grylls on his book? the greatest story. How did that work out?
Yeah, well, gosh, it's a bit of a long story now. Bear and I have been friends for quite a while now, and it goes back to a mutual friend who put us in touch. My first book I wrote was a kind of overview of the Bible story, the Bible, a story that makes sense of life. And Bear kindly endorsed that through this mutual friendship. But I think he endorsed it, but it also had quite an impact on him as he read it and understood that the way the whole Bible forms one big story. So he reached out to me, and we got into some conversations about, wouldn't it be great to do some more stuff together to help people understand this? So, one thing led to another. And I think I'm trying to recall, but the next thing we did together was we filmed a TV series actually in Israel. Fortunately, just before October the 7th and when all of the trouble started. So we were very fortunate. And, I was mainly behind the camera as theological consultant, and then a bit of time on the camera as well in conversation with Bear. And he was doing his thing, skydiving in and finding snakes. And then he was also meeting with experts.
I thought that was on YouTube. I think it's brilliant. I absolutely loved it. I didn't know you were that.
Yeah, it's called Refugee, Renegade, Redeemer. And I think I make a sort of appearance in episodes 3 and episode 5. But throughout, it's telling the story of Jesus, really. It was just Bear doing his thing and then meeting experts at different sites. And so that was a huge privilege. I loved doing that. And then we worked on Hodder approached us both about doing a Young Explorers edition of the Bible. And I've always really wanted to play my part in helping young people feel the Bible is exciting. And so doing that with Bear was a real privilege. And that's had a great impact as well. Pitched kind of for 8 to 12-year-olds. So you can, that's out, NIV, the NIV Bible for Young Explorers with Bear Grylls and Andrew Ollerton. So that was the next project. But I knew after we'd been to Israel that it really affected Bear to see the sights and hear the story. And he was really immersed in it. And so I wasn't surprised when he reached out and said, we've got to write a book about Jesus. And one of the things I love about him, he's got such a heart to just get the story out in a really simple, honest, accessible way, not churchy, not complicated, not religious. Just strip it back to the essentials and the original kind of immersive experience. And so that's what we set out to do. And I think, it's been one of the greatest privileges for me to work on that, and then to see the impact it's having. I keep meeting people who are reading it, some of whom are not Christians and are on a journey because of it. So it's exciting.
Yeah, I was there for the book launch in London that you were at as well, and brought some guys from church. My son was there. I think there's just something amazing when you hear people like Bear Grylls that you've seen on TV talking about faith. And it's clear that he's not an every Sunday in a church kind of Christian. He's somebody who's working this faith out in the messiness of life. And it really just brought some encouragement, particularly to some of the guys that I took along. Just hearing him talking about the impact that Jesus has on his life. It's really encouraging when you just hear folk that you don't necessarily expect to speak that way of Jesus. It was really, really wonderful. I know my son Isaac thought it was great as well.
Yeah, I think I'm so pleased to hear that, because I think that's what he wants. That's what I want. And I think, he does have this disarming ability to just put things straight and to speak from the heart. He's brilliant at doing that on camera. You can just put a camera in front of Bear and he'll talk from the heart, as in such a fluid and honest way. And I think he's done that with this book. So one of the things I love about it is that we worked really hard, actually. So this was my main role with the book. I didn't write any of it, but I was all over the detail to try and make it as accurate as we could whilst not losing the creative flair. So it's accurate, it's detailed. It's going to give you a fairly good harmonization of the 4 gospel accounts, as close to the chronological order as we can tease out. So there's an accuracy to it. And Bear was really concerned for that. He kept saying, we've got to get this right. He wanted all of the words to be a translation, at least, of the words of Jesus, not putting any words in Jesus' mouth, which I really appreciated as well as a value. And yet, we've done that, but he hasn't lost that kind of, that everyday touch, that sense that actually this story, whilst the names we chose to use names that go back to the Aramaic and the Greek and the Hebrew. So whilst the names may disorientate those who think they're familiar with the story, and that was part of the idea, simultaneously you're disorientated, thinking, "Gosh, this is a very different culture," and yet this is strangely familiar. Like, this is our story. These are our issues played out in the first century. So I think it's a winning combination. That.
Yeah, I think it's great. Andrew, thank you so much for spending time with me. Now, your book, God's Book, An Honest Look at the Bible in Seven Tough Topics. That's a tongue twister. That's out now, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's actually out on the 25th of September in the UK. It's going to be published separately in the US later, but 25th of September. And just a couple of things about it. It's available as a print copy, Kindle, and I've just actually today finished recording the Audible version of it. So it's in all three formats. But a lot of churches and small groups and youth groups are planning to journey through it. So I'm also developing with some partner churches some sort of resources for a Sunday series. So you can actually go Genesis. Let's go Genesis to Revelation, the God's Book series. Let's go through the whole Bible, addressing the toughest topics. I think there's something deeply reassuring for congregations to see leaders saying, we're not going to shy away from, there's nothing we need to hide here. Let's look at the hard things in their context. That's the key thing I do in the book, is say these things make a lot more sense in their context, historical and narrative context. So there's also discussion guides and small group video content. But one final thing is, at the end of each part, and you'll be the judge of this, the listener, the reader, I decided to write a letter to one of my 3 children who are now young adults, because I wanted to sort of, having done the academic thing, it's not academic in tone, it's accessible for everyday people, short chapters, lots of application. But having done the more sort of intellectual, how do we respond to these? I wanted to do the honest thing of say, and what difference does this make? How does this actually affect the way we live our lives today? And I decided that, I've had so many interesting, I don't know about you, my kids put me on the spot. They ask the difficult questions, the ones that, keep you thinking and guessing. And so I just thought I wanted to draw on all the conversations I've had with different moments with them, and to write a letter to one of them at the end of each one. My hope is that will really inspire youth groups and, young people to think, actually, we don't need, I don't know about you, Chris. I feel like sometimes we patronize our young people as if the Bible's too complicated for them. Honestly, what my 13-year-old son is doing in maths is way more complicated than anything in my book. That's for sure. So, I just think, let's not patronize young people. If they have got an appetite, let's let them loose on some of these tough things and let them explore it in a safe space together. So I hope it'll do that as well. So groups and churches can go through it.
I love how you laid those out as well, because it was the font changed and became more like handwriting font. So it felt like a letter that you'd written. So it actually felt engaging. You engaged with it in a different way, I guess, because it was.
It's definitely more applied and it's more personal. And I wanted to finish that. It's actually possible, isn't it, for you and I? We spend a lot of time in the academic world. You can almost hide in that world and avoid getting to the kind of coalface of what difference does this make, and how do we actually apply this? And I sort of thought, I just don't want I mustn't hide. And the letters were my way of being really honest and straightforward about why I think these things matter.
It's simplifying without being simplistic.
Yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's how do we take these big ideas and actually craft it in such a way it's easy to understand without losing the profoundness.
Yeah, exactly. I like the way you put that, simplified without being simplistic. That's what I aimed for throughout the book, actually. And I'm actually quietly just really excited about it, because helping people think through these things, it's almost like if you can get your head around these things, there's nothing you need to fear in the Bible. Don't worry, you're all good. You've looked at the hardest things and you've got some confidence there. You can now feel more confident to talk about your faith as well.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and thank you for coming to Spring Harvest to do Bible teaching for us next year.
I'm looking forward to that.
To come to Spring Harvest, but for those that will, we are dead excited that you are coming to Bible teach. It's going to be brilliant. So thank you. If anybody wants to find out anything more about you, about the book, where should they go?
My website, andrewollerton.com. All of the resources for churches and small groups linked to this new book, God's Book, will be there. Or follow me on social media at Andy Ollerton. Yeah.
Brilliant. Andrew, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Chris. Loved it.
Grace and peace.